Robert's retired life was supposed to be a series of quiet days in this peaceful town. But life has a way of offering new beginnings, and love is no exception. A small wool scarf lies draped over his armchair, the only thing left of the woman who changed his world. She vanished without a trace, just before their most important date. Now, a fragile clue has emerged, a clue that could push this 65-year-old man into a desperate journey halfway across the world. He might find the love of his life, or he might lose himself forever in a land he does not know. Join us as we uncover this incredible journey. Before we begin, please support us by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more touching tales. The wind howled through the silver birch trees of Vermont. It was a lonely sound. Robert stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his study. He watched the snow dust the rolling hills in white. Everything was pristine, everything was expensive, and everything was silent. At 65, Robert had reached the summit of his career. He had been the chief executive officer of a global firm. He had spent decades making deals and moving markets. His walls were covered in fine art from galleries in New York and Paris. But as he stared at a silent oil painting, he realized something. The paint did not smile back. The marble statues did not ask how his day was. He had retired to this small town for peace, but he found that peace without people was just another word for solitude. He sighed. His breath fogged the cold glass. Today he needed groceries. It was a small task, but it was the only thing on his calendar. He put on his heavy wool coat and stepped out into the crisp air. The local supermarket was warm and smelled of cinnamon. Robert pushed his cart slowly down the aisle. He was looking at a display of oranges when he saw her. She was petite. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat clip. She was wearing a bright yellow scarf that seemed to defy the gray winter outside. She was reaching for a box on a high shelf. She stood on her tiptoes. She moved with a grace that caught his eye. She was quick. She was energetic. Robert stepped forward. "Allow me to help you with that." He reached up and handed her the box. She turned and looked at him, her eyes crinkled at the corners. "Thank you so much. You are very kind." Her voice had a soft, melodic accent. It was like a song he had never heard before. She smiled, and the coldness he had felt all morning seemed to melt. I am Robert." They stood there for a moment between the oranges and the bread. It was just a few seconds, but the silence of his big house felt very far away. A few days later, Robert found himself walking toward the town cafe. He told himself he just wanted a good cup of coffee, but he knew he was looking for the yellow scarf. He found her behind the counter. She was busy wiping tables and laughing with the regulars. When she saw him, her face lit up. "Mr. Robert, you came for coffee?" "Yes. And maybe a conversation." He sat at a small wooden table by the window. Mai came over whenever she had a break. They talked. He told her about his life in the corporate world. He spoke of boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. He spoke of the stress and the long nights. He had never told anyone how tired those years had made him. Mai listened with her chin in her hands. She did not care about his titles. She cared about the man behind them. Then it was her turn. She spoke of a world he only knew from maps. She spoke of Vietnam. She described the green rice paddies that looked like velvet. She told him about her large family in a small village. She talked about her mother who taught her how to cook with ginger and lemongrass. She told him how she had come to America to be with her daughter. Everything was new to her. Everything was an adventure. Your home sounds beautiful. It is. But home is where the heart is happy. Robert felt a thump in his chest. He had not felt his heart beat like that in a very long time. Weeks turned into months. The winter snow began to soften. The ice on the lake started to crack. And so did the shell around Robert's life. One afternoon, they met at the local community center. There was an old upright piano in the corner of the hall. The keys were slightly yellowed. The wood was scratched. Robert sat down. He stretched his fingers. He had not played seriously for years. He began to play a soft classical piece. The notes filled the dusty room. Mai stood beside the piano. She began to hum. Then she began to sing. She sang a folk song from her childhood. The words were in a language Robert did not understand. But the emotion was clear. It was a song of longing. It was a song of love. He watched her as he played. Her eyes were closed. She was lost in the music. In that moment, the 65-year-old businessman was gone. He was just a man who was finally learning how to breathe. He realized that he was no longer just waiting for the days to pass, he was looking forward to them. He was no longer just retired, he was alive. The song ended. The last note lingered in the air like a promise. Mai looked at him and whispered, "That was beautiful, Robert." He stood up and took her hand. It was small and warm. "No, Mai. This is beautiful." Outside, the sun was setting over the Vermont hills. The sky was a bruise of purple and gold. The storm had passed, and for the first time in his life, Robert was not afraid of the quiet, because he was no longer alone. The evening was perfect. The air in Robert's kitchen was filled with the scent of roasted rosemary and garlic. He had spent hours preparing everything. He had selected the finest linens. He had polished the silver until it gleamed like mirrors. In the center of the table stood a vase of fresh lilies. They were white and pure. Robert checked his watch. It was nearly 7 o'clock. He straightened his tie in the hallway mirror. He looked at his reflection and smiled. For the first time in years, he did not see a retired executive. He saw a man with a future. He had a small velvet box in his pocket. It was not an engagement ring. It was a simple locket, a token of his affection, a way to say that he wanted her to stay in his life forever. The clock struck 7. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling cider. He sat on the sofa and waited. He listened for the sound of her small car on the gravel driveway. He listened for her light knock on the heavy oak door. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The ice in the bucket began to melt. The candles burned lower. Robert stood up and paced the room. Perhaps she was stuck in traffic. Perhaps she had lost track of time. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. He waited for her cheerful greeting. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Robert froze. He stared at the screen. He dialed again, slowly, carefully. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." A cold chill settled in his chest. It was a feeling he had not felt since the high-pressure days of the stock market. But this was worse. This was personal. He waited until midnight. The dinner grew cold. The candles flickered and died. The house returned to its old, heavy silence. The empty chair across from him felt like a ghost. The next morning, Robert drove to the cafe. His hands were trembling on the steering wheel. He expected to see her yellow scarf through the window. He expected to hear her laughter, but the cafe was different. The music was too loud. A young man he did not recognize was behind the counter. Robert approached him. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Mai." The young man didn't even look up from the espresso machine. "She's gone. Quit 2 days ago." Robert felt the world tilt. "What do you mean she quit? Where is she?" The boy shrugged. "I don't know, man. She just said she had to leave." Robert drove to her small apartment on the edge of town. He knocked on the door. He knocked until his knuckles turned red. A neighbor stepped out into the hallway, an elderly woman with a curious gaze. "If you are looking for the lady who lived there, she left in a hurry. A taxi took her to the airport yesterday morning." Robert leaned against the wall. "Did she leave a note? An address?" "Nothing. She looked like she had been crying. That is all I know." Robert returned to his big empty house. He felt like he was suffocating under the weight of his own success. He had millions in the bank. He had influence. He had power. But he could not find the one person who made him happy. He spent 3 days calling every contact he knew. He reached out to the local community center. Finally, he found a woman named Elena. She was a friend of Mai's from the Vietnamese cultural group. Robert met her in a quiet park. Elena looked at him with sad eyes. "Oh, Robert," she wanted to tell you. But everything happened so fast. What happened? Her mother passed away, back in her village in Vietnam. It was sudden. Mai was devastated. She had to catch the first flight she could find. She was in such a state of grief she forgot her phone. She forgot everything except getting home. Robert looked down at his hands. "Where is this village?" Elena shook her head. She talked about the mountains in the north, but I don't have an address. She didn't have time to write it down. She just kept saying she had to go back to the clouds. Robert sat on the park bench long after Elena left. He thought about his life. He thought about all the times he had said he would do something later. He had waited for retirement to be happy. He had waited for the perfect moment to tell Mai he loved her. And now she was gone. He realized that for a man of 65 years old, later is a lie. Someday is a trap. The only time that matters is now. He went home and opened his safe. He looked at his passport. He looked at the stacks of documents that represented his wealth. None of it mattered if he was alone in Vermont. He opened his laptop. He searched for flights to Vietnam. His finger hovered over the button. He was an old man. He did not speak the language. He had never been to Asia. The mountains of the north were a mystery to him. But he remembered her voice. He remembered the way she sang. He remembered the light she brought into his dark hallways. He clicked the button. Confirmed. He began to pack. He did not take much. A few changes of clothes, his sturdy walking shoes, and a small photograph of Mai singing at the piano. He tucked it into his breast pocket. Right over his heart, he looked around his mansion one last time, the expensive paintings, the silent statues. He realized he wasn't leaving home. He was going to find it. The quiet after the storm was over. The journey had begun. The heavy cabin door of the airplane opened. A wave of thick, humid air rushed in to meet Robert. It smelled of jasmine and charcoal smoke and rain. It was nothing like the crisp, dry air of Vermont. As he stepped onto the tarmac of Ho Chi Minh City, he felt a sudden jolt in his chest. It was not fear. It was adrenaline. The airport was a hive of motion. Thousands of people moved in every direction. Voices rose and fell in a tonal language that sounded like music to his ears. Outside the terminal, the city exploded into view. A literal sea of motorbikes flowed through the streets like a river of steel. They carried families and flowers and even small trees. The colors were vibrant. Bright red banners hung from balconies. Green vines climbed up weathered yellow walls. Robert stood on the sidewalk with his small suitcase. He felt tiny. He felt lost. And for the first time in his 65 years, he felt completely free. He began his journey the next morning. He did not have a map to her heart, but he had a direction. He headed north. He traveled on trains that rattled through emerald jungles. He sat in small buses that wound their way up into the Central Highlands. At every stop, he would take out the photograph. The edges were slightly curled now. He showed it to shopkeepers in narrow alleys. He showed it to elderly men playing chess in city parks. He showed it to young mothers carrying children. Do you know this woman? Her name is Mai. Most people shook their heads. Some looked at the photo with kindness and whispered words he could not understand. But they always smiled. They offered him tea. They offered him a stool to sit on. Robert was a man who used to measure success by the closing of a deal. Now he measured success by the warmth of a stranger's nod. As the days turned into weeks, he reached a remote village nestled in the red earth of the highlands. The people here were hard-working, but the land was dry. The coffee plants were thirsty. The irrigation system was a tangle of rusted pipes and broken dreams. Robert stood by the dusty road and watched the farmers struggle. His old corporate mind began to wake up. He did not see a foreign village. He saw a logistical problem that needed a solution. He spent 3 days sitting with the village elders. He used a stick to draw diagrams in the dirt. He calculated pressure and flow. He used his phone to translate technical terms. He reached into his retirement savings not for a luxury car, but for high-density plastic pipes and a solar-powered pump. He worked alongside the young men of the village. His hands grew calloused. His expensive shirts were stained with red clay. When the water finally surged through the new pipes, the village erupted in cheers. An old woman grabbed his hand and pressed it to her cheek. Robert felt a lump in his throat. He realized that his decades of business experience were not just for making money. They were tools, and he was finally using them to build something that mattered. A few towns later, he stopped at a rural school. The roof was leaking, and the children had only a few tattered books to share. Robert did not just write a check. He stayed. He helped repair the roof. He sat on the floor and helped the children with their English. He laughed as they tried to pronounce his name. They called him Robat. He found that their laughter was louder than the silence of his mansion in Vermont. The man who had landed in Ho Chi Minh City was gone. The CEO who valued time as money had disappeared. In his place was a man who found peace in the simple things. He found joy in a bowl of steaming pho at a roadside stall. He loved the way the broth warmed his soul after a long day. He loved the way the steam fogged his glasses. He loved the kindness of the strangers who invited him to share their tables. He He still looked at the photograph of Mai every night before he slept. The search was still his mission, but he was no longer desperate. He realized that even if he never found her, he had found himself. He had found a reason to wake up in the morning. He was 65 years old and his life was just beginning. He looked out at the rolling green hills of the highlands as the sun began to set. The sky was a deep shade of orange. He felt a strange sense of gratitude. He thanked the world for the courage to leave his comfort zone. He thanked the wind for leading him this far. The air grew cooler as the bus climbed higher toward the north. The mountains were waiting. And somewhere in those clouds, he knew she was there. He tucked the photograph back into his pocket. He closed his eyes and listened to the hum of the engine. He was a traveler now, a man with a purpose, a man who was no longer afraid of the road ahead. The air in the mountains of Sapa was thin and cold. It reminded Robert of the winters in Vermont, but here the wind did not feel lonely. It felt alive. Large blankets of mist rolled over the jagged peaks like giant waves of white silk. Everything was hidden and then revealed, hidden and then revealed. Robert stood in the bed of a sturdy old truck. He was surrounded by boxes of thick wool coats and colorful scarves. He had joined a group of volunteers from the city. They were traveling to the highest reaches of the northern border. His joints ached from the long climb. His hair was white with the mountain dampness, but his eyes were bright. He was no longer the man who hid behind a mahogany desk. He was a man who carried warmth to those who needed it. They reached the school just as the sun tried to pierce through the fog. It was a small building made of wood and stone. The roof was dark with moisture. Groups of children stood in the courtyard. They had rosy cheeks and shy smiles. They wore traditional clothes with intricate patterns of indigo and red. Robert began to hand out the coats. He knelt down so he could look the children in the eye. He zipped up their jackets. He patted their shoulders. He did not need to speak their language to see their gratitude. The work was busy. The air was filled with the sound of zippers and excited chatter. But then the wind shifted. A sound drifted through an open window of the classroom. It was soft. It was a humming melody. It was a tune that had haunted Robert's dreams for months. The notes were light and airy. They carried a touch of sadness, but a great deal of hope. Robert froze. The coat he was holding slipped from his fingers. He stood up slowly. His heart began to drum against his ribs. The volunteers around him continued to work. The children continued to laugh. But for Robert, the world had gone silent except for that one voice. He followed the sound. His boots crunched on the gravel. He walked toward the wooden door of the end classroom. He reached out a hand. His fingers trembled as he pushed the door open. The room was filled with golden light from a single window. A group of children sat in a circle on the floor. In the center of the circle was a woman. She was wearing a simple dark dress and a handmade shawl. She was showing the children how to draw a flower on a small chalkboard. She was singing as she worked. It was Mai. She looked different. There was a depth of sorrow in her eyes that had not been there before. But there was also a profound peace. She turned toward the door. She saw the tall American man standing there. She saw his weathered face. She saw the red clay on his boots. She saw the love that had traveled 10,000 miles to find her. The chalk fell from her hand and snapped on the floor. The children looked at her and then at the stranger. Neither of them spoke. There was no need for explanations. There was no need for apologies about the silence or the disconnected phone. All the pain of the past months evaporated in the mountain air. Mai stepped forward. Her voice was a whisper. Robert. He reached out and took her hands. They were cold from the mountain air, but they felt like home. I found you. I never thought you would come this far. I would have gone further. They stood together in the middle of the classroom. A quiet tear tracked down Robert's cheek. He realized that his search was over, but his life was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Robert made a phone call to Vermont. He spoke to his lawyers. He spoke to his house manager. He told them to sell the mansion. He told them to donate the expensive art to a museum. He did not want to live in a house filled with things anymore. He wanted to live in a place filled with meaning. He stayed in the mountains. He used his remaining wealth to build a new wing for the school. He funded a medical clinic for the local families. He found that his executive skills were perfect for organizing logistics in the rugged terrain. He was no longer a CEO of a corporation. He was a partner in a mission of the heart. The days in Sapa were long and full of purpose. They woke up to the sound of roosters and the sight of clouds drifting past their windows. They spent their afternoons teaching and their evenings together. As the sun began to dip below the horizon one evening, they sat on their wooden porch. Below them, the rice terraces carved into the mountainside looked like giant stairs made of emerald. The valley was turning a deep shade of indigo. Robert had a small electronic keyboard on his lap. He played a gentle chord. Mai sat beside him. She leaned her head on his shoulder. She began to sing. It was the same song she had sung in the community center in Vermont, but now her voice was stronger. It was the song of two souls who had been lost and were now found. The music drifted out over the terraces. It rose into the mist. It joined the wind. Halfway across the world from where they started, they had finally found where they belonged. Robert closed his eyes and played the final note. The quiet was no longer empty. It was full of love. Robert and Mai found that the richest part of life is not what we collect, but who we hold on to and how we give back to the world. Their journey reminds us that it is never too late to start a new chapter or to travel across the globe for a soul that feels like home. If this story moves you today, please tell us where you are watching from in the comments. We would love to hear about your city, your state, or your country. And please subscribe to join our family for more touching tales. To keep the warmth in your heart a little longer, click on the newest video appearing on your screen right now and let us share another journey together.